Friend, I appreciate you being here with me today. Let me ask you something. Have you ever walked into a space where the atmosphere suddenly felt heavier than it should? Where the quiet wasn't calming, but tense, loaded with an unspoken sense that something was wrong? A feeling everyone could sense, yet no one was willing to say out loud. That is the exact mood hanging over Washington right now. And you would never guess it if all you did was watch the nightly news. The cameras keep rolling, commentators keep bickering over surface-level distractions, but underneath it all, something deep and foundational has cracked. I need you to really focus on what has happened in just the last 72 hours. While most people were scrolling endlessly through their feeds, a massive shift in power quietly unfolded between Washington and Ottawa, and it is going to land directly on American wallets in ways most people are not prepared for. Canada just told Trump no, not a soft diplomatic no, not a cautious or fearful refusal, but a firm strategic rejection backed by a calculated $116 billion pivot that is already transforming North American energy markets in real time. Here is the reality. Canada's natural gas exports to the United States have fallen off a cliff. We are talking about a 40% collapse in less than a year. Let's put real numbers on that, because they matter. In January of 2025, Canada was shipping roughly 9 billion cubic feet of natural gas per day into the U.S. As of last Friday, that figure dropped to about 5.4 billion cubic feet per day. This is not seasonal noise. This is not a temporary maintenance disruption. This is a deliberate pullback from the American market. And this is where the story gets even more striking. As Canadian gas flows into the U.S. are plunging, Mark Carney was standing beside Chinese President Xi Jinping in Beijing, announcing that Canada will scale up production to 50 million tons of liquefied natural gas per year by 2030. Every shipment is earmarked for Asia. Not a single molecule is intended for the United States. None of this is accidental. This is the direct consequence of Trump's tariff strategy detonating in the opposite direction. The early effects are already showing up in energy bills, manufacturing costs, and America's broader geopolitical leverage. Today, we are going to break down the mechanics of how this unfolded, looking closely at the pieces most mainstream outlets are barely touching. We need to examine the actual data behind Canada's energy pivot, understand what triggered it, unpack Carney's $116 billion nation-building alternative that completely sidesteps the U.S., and assess the geopolitical shockwave this creates for American energy security heading into 2026 and beyond. Because here is the part that almost no one is saying out loud. When your most dependable energy partner, the country that provides about 60% of your foreign oil, along with enormous volumes of natural gas, decides it would rather sell to Asia at higher prices, you lose negotiating strength. Suddenly, you are the one who needs them more than they need you. That reversal of leverage happened far faster than anyone in Washington expected. Let me walk you through how we got here and why this matters far more than the headlines suggest. We have to rewind to August of 2025. That is when Trump slapped 35% tariffs on most Canadian goods. The logic seemed straightforward at the time. Apply economic pressure, force concessions on border security, trade rules, and energy supply. It is the classic strong-arm approach of a superpower accustomed to compliance. The assumption inside the White House was that Canada, polite and economically intertwined, would cave. The belief was that the Canadian economy could not function without open access to U.S. consumers and that Carney would show up desperate for a deal. But Carney didn't flinch. Instead of backing down, he made an announcement that should have triggered alarm bells across Washington. He stated plainly that Canada would intentionally cut its trade with the United States in half over the next decade. Many analysts brushed it off as political theater. It wasn't. The plan was already in motion, and its centerpiece sat on Canada's west coast, nearly ready to operate. That project was LNG Canada, one of the cleanest liquefied natural gas facilities ever built, backed by Shell, Petronas, PetroChina, Mitsubishi, and Korea Gas. This was not a hypothetical proposal. This was fully built infrastructure. The first major shipment left for South Korea in early January of 2026. A $40 billion investment spanning more than a decade, and it fundamentally reshapes North American energy flows. Here is why this is so important. Canadian producers now have a real alternative. Asian buyers are paying 30 to 40% more than North American prices for LNG. The math is brutal. Why keep selling discounted gas to a customer, threatening tariffs and questioning sovereignty when you can ship it west and collect premium prices from partners offering stability? The data confirms it. Canada's total energy export value in October 2025 fell 12.4% year over year. Heavy crude exports to the U.S., where Canada supplies about 60% of foreign oil, dropped nearly 19% in value. This is happening now, not in some distant scenario. Trump's response has been silence on the energy fallout. Acknowledging it would mean admitting the leverage failed. It would require explaining why heating bills are climbing and why manufacturers are being squeezed. And the situation gets even more complex because this pivot is being locked in physically, not just politically. We need to talk about the Coastal GasLink pipeline, a 670-kilometer artery connecting Western Canadian gas fields directly to the Kitimat terminal. This pipeline bypasses traditional southbound routes into the U.S. The gas flows west to Asia instead of south to America. Once steel is in the ground and flows reverse, you cannot undo it with rhetoric. Energy physics does not care about tweets. Carney went further. In November 2025, he announced a second wave of nation-building projects. 7 new initiatives added to 5 announced earlier, totaling $116 billion in investment. Among them is the Cassis-Lycium's LNG facility, Canada's second major export terminal, capable of shipping 12 million tons annually, again almost entirely to Asia. Now here is why timing is everything. As Canada pulls back exports, U.S. demand is accelerating. The Energy Information Administration projects U.S. dry gas production averaging 109.1 billion cubic feet per day in 2026. That sounds large until you realize it is only a 1.3% increase from 2025, far slower than previous growth. Demand is surging because of data centers, AI infrastructure, and new LNG export terminals along the Gulf Coast. When Canada removes 3.6 billion cubic feet per day from the market, prices rise. Henry Hub prices are projected to average around $3.90 per million BTUs in 2026, up sharply from near $2 in 2024. Some forecasts go higher, and reduced Canadian imports are a key factor. Natural gas heats 47% of American homes. That means families in places like Michigan or Minnesota could see winter bills rise 25 to 30%. That is not guesswork. That is arithmetic. Manufacturing suffers even more. Gas is a feedstock for chemicals, fertilizers, plastics, and steel. When prices double, margins collapse. Plants cut output, jobs disappear. Multiply that across the Midwest and Northeast, and the damage becomes systemic. Meanwhile, Asian buyers are thrilled. Japan and South Korea want stable supply after watching Russia weaponize energy. Canada delivers reliability and scale. Long-term contracts are being signed now, locking in volumes for decades. This is not just economics. It is geopolitics. Carney has been explicit about reducing dependence on an unpredictable U.S. administration. Trade with China has been reset. Tariffs slashed. Investment unlocked. Legally, Trump's tariffs created the very outcome they were meant to avoid. Imposed under emergency powers, ruled illegal but left in place during appeals, they convinced Canada that U.S. trade policy was unreliable. Even Republican leaders have criticized the strategy, but the infrastructure is already built. You cannot reverse concrete and steel. Looking ahead, the next 6 to 12 months matter. Canadian exports to Asia will ramp up. U.S. prices will stay elevated. Political pressure will rise. Long-term contracts will lock in supply away from American markets. The 2026 trade review looms, but leverage has shifted. This mirrors the oil shocks of the 1970s, only inverted. Instead of Middle Eastern producers cutting supply, Canada diversified supply. The result is the same: lost leverage for Washington. Analysts warn the U.S. is sleepwalking into a structural disadvantage. Governors are frustrated. Businesses want stability, but policy is driving uncertainty. Carney's strategy is about resilience. Canada is building alternatives that attract global capital and lock in independence. Investment is rebounding. Growth is increasingly non-U.S. driven. Meanwhile, Americans pay higher prices. Canada's share of exports to the U.S. keeps shrinking, and every point lost is leverage gone. The uncomfortable truth is this: when you weaponize trade against your closest ally, do not be shocked when they find better customers. Customers who pay more, sign longer contracts, and offer stability. Asia's energy demand is growing. Canada positioned itself perfectly. For Americans, the consequences are higher bills, squeezed industries, and political backlash. The assumption that Canada needed the U.S. more than the U.S. needed Canada has been shattered in real time. And this extends beyond energy. Allies are watching. The lesson they see is unpredictability. What we are witnessing is not a temporary spat. Pipelines are permanent. LNG terminals are generational commitments.